Eudaimanya, systems and frameworks to improve habits, mind, and life.
Imagine you are a turkey.
Okay, a turkey.
Right, you live on this sprawling, comfortable farm, and for, 999 days, the farmer comes out every single morning, rain or shine, and feeds you.
Sounds like a pretty good deal.
Exactly. If you're a statistically minded turkey, you are plotting this data on a graph. Day 1, fed. Day 50, fed. Day 500, fed. The data is unequivocally clear. Humans are benevolent creatures, your environment is perfectly safe, and, your life trajectory is pointing straight up.
Right, you have literally never been safer than on day 999.
Yes. But then, Wednesday afternoon arrives. It is the day before Thanksgiving. Welcome to Eudaimanya, Antifragile.
That is a brutal awakening for the turkey, isn't it? That sudden total revision of reality.
Brutal is an understatement, but it's the perfect place to start. Because if you are joining us for this deep dive, we are taking a massive stack of sources, excerpts, translated chapters, detailed notes, straight from Nassim Nicholas Taleb's groundbreaking work, Antifragile.
Yeah, and our mission today is really to decode this concept, to build a systematic guide for you, the listener, on how to make decisions in a world that is just completely dominated by the unknown.
Right, because I've got all these texts in front of me, and I'm trying to act as the, internal analyst here, figuring out how these gears turn. But I definitely need you here to provide that external tension. We need to figure out why that turkey got it so horribly wrong.
Well, the turkey got it wrong because of a fundamental misunderstanding of how the world actually works. To really set the stage for this, let's look at 3 specific scenarios drawn from the source material.
Okay.
Because these highlight the exact same blindness the turkey had, just in human form. First, picture a high-flying financial trader in the year 2008.
Oh, wow. Okay, let's unpack this. So this trader is sitting in a glass office, relying completely on what he believes are perfectly infallible predictive computer models, right?
Exactly. He is looking at historical data, just like the turkey. His models tell him that based on, the last 10 years of market behavior, the risk of a total market collapse is practically zero.
He thinks he has the world figured out.
Right. He has optimized his entire portfolio for maximum efficiency based on that exact prediction. And then an uncomputable, exceedingly rare economic event occurs, and he is completely ruined. Wiped out entirely.
Because his model couldn't predict a totally unprecedented crisis. So that's the financial realm. But I was reading ahead in the notes, and there's a second scenario that hits a little closer to home.
The medical one.
Yeah, medicine. So we have a well-meaning doctor. A patient comes in with minor back pain or maybe a mild case of insomnia. The doctor wants to fix it immediately, so they aggressively prescribe a treatment.
Right, maybe it's an unnecessary spinal surgery or a very heavy daily sedative.
Exactly. And what happens? The aggressive intervention to eliminate a minor natural fluctuation, like the pain or the sleeplessness, causes severe dependency. Or the surgery results in a massive infection.
Ultimately, the cure causes vastly worse harm to the patient than the original minor ailment ever would have.
The intervention itself becomes the crisis. And then there's a third scenario on a macro scale, a government.
Right.
A government decides it needs to artificially stabilize the prices of goods. Or perhaps it tries to create a massive, heavily centralized nation state because it wants to completely eliminate any local political volatility.
They want no arguments, no price swings, just smooth, predictable control.
But in their attempt to make everything smooth and perfectly predictable, they inadvertently destroy the entire system's natural ability to adapt to actual stress.
When a real economic shock finally hits, the system doesn't bend. It just shatters. They built a giant, fragile monolith.
So what does this all mean? We have a ruined trader, a patient suffering from side effects way worse than their disease, and a collapsed, heavily controlled economy. What actually ties these together?
What's fascinating here is that synthesizing these 3 examples reveals the core theme of the entire text, and that is eliminating variation hides fragility.
Eliminating variation hides fragility.
Yes. Our modern world has developed this absolute obsession with order. We want to smooth out every bump, medicate every minor discomfort, and, regulate away every market fluctuation.
But the source material makes a deeply counterintuitive argument here, right?
Exactly. By doing this, we are not making ourselves safer. We are actually making our economies, our bodies, and our institutions profoundly weak.
I see what you're saying. It's the illusion of safety. We think that because we haven't seen a market crash or felt a pang of pain or experienced a political uprising in 10 years, we have somehow conquered risk.
But the text is saying we haven't conquered it at all.
Oh.
We've just pushed it into the shadows where it's quietly compounding. Which brings us to the core of this whole illusion, the failure of the predictive paradigm.
And this centers around a concept we hear all the time now, right? The black swan.
Yes. A black swan, and it's capitalized in the text to denote its specific definition, is a large-scale, irregular, and highly unpredictable event that carries massive consequences. But the key is, it is an event that is completely unpredicted by a given observer. That last part is crucial. Let's go back to your opening hook. The event Thanksgiving was a catastrophic black swan to the turkey.
Right.
But importantly, it was not a black swan to the butcher.
Wait, hold on. So a black swan isn't an absolute truth of the universe. It's relative.
Precisely. It depends entirely on your exposure to the event and your reliance on past data to predict the future.
Oh, I see.
The turkey mistook a lack of past harm for a guarantee of future safety. It was looking at the past in a domain where the past is completely irrelevant to the underlying hidden risk. The butcher, however, understood the architecture of the farm. He knew the hidden mechanism.
So this is where modern economics and business schools totally fail us, according to the text. We have this deeply ingrained idea that we can calculate risk. Like, we hire armies of statisticians to tell us the exact probability of a recession or a supply chain failure.
And the text is explicitly hostile to that idea. It argues that risk cannot be measured outside of casinos.
Outside of casinos.
Right. This is a concept termed the ludic fallacy. The word ludic comes from ludus, the Latin word for game. It is the fallacy of mistaking the mathematically pure, well-defined uncertainty of a casino or a board game for the messy, intractable uncertainty of real life.
I'm not sure I fully grasp why the math wouldn't apply everywhere, though. I mean, if a statistician can calculate the odds of a roulette wheel, why can't they calculate the odds of the stock market crashing? Math is math, isn't it?
Well, let me play devil's advocate to your math is math point. In a casino, you know exactly what the odds of rolling a double six are.
Sure, 1 in 36.
Exactly. The rules are closed. The physical possibilities are capped. You know every single variable that exists in the room. You can calculate the absolute worst-case scenario. But real life is an open system. The rules are not closed.
Okay, I get it. In real life, you could be betting on the roulette wheel, but suddenly the casino catches fire. Or the currency you are betting with hyperinflates to zero while the ball is literally still bouncing.
Yes. Or the casino owner gets arrested and confiscates everyone's chips. None of those variables are in the statistical model for the game of roulette.
Exactly. The variables in real life are infinite and unknowable. And this is why the text distinguishes between two fundamental domains of reality: mediocristan and extremistan.
Yes. This is how we explain the mechanism of why prediction fails.
Mediocristan and extremistan. Walk me through the actual mechanics of these two domains. Why do they behave so differently?
Well, mediocristan is governed by physical laws and bounds. Think of human height or weight or the number of calories a person can consume in a day.
Yeah.
You will never meet a human being who is 3 miles tall. You will never meet someone who weighs 40,000 pounds. Because there are hard physical limits, the average is actually a very meaningful number.
Because no single outlier can drastically change the total. Right.
Exactly. If you put 1,000 random people in a stadium, and then the heaviest person on Earth walks in, the average weight of the room barely moves.
Because physical reality puts a ceiling on the variance. Okay, so what is the engine driving extremistan then?
Extremistan lacks those physical ceilings. It is driven by things like social scaling, digital duplication, network effects, and zero marginal costs.
So, like the internet.
Yes. This is the domain of wealth, financial markets, book sales, internet traffic. If you put 1,000 random people in a stadium and then a billionaire like Elon Musk walks in, the average net worth of the room suddenly skyrockets to millions of dollars per person.
Wow.
One single event, one single outlier, can represent 99% of the total historical impact.
Right, because wealth, unlike physical weight, isn't constrained by gravity. A digital book costs absolutely nothing to reproduce, so one single author can capture 99% of the global market, while a million other authors sell zero.
Exactly.
That's physically impossible in mediocristan. Like, a baker can only bake so much bread in a day, they can't physically capture the entire global bread market.
Exactly. And because these rare events in extremistan, the black swans, are not constrained by physical limits, They are not computable.
The math just breaks.
The math we use for mediocrism, like the standard bell curve, fundamentally breaks down. Therefore, predicting them is mathematically impossible. It is a fool's errand.
Okay, let's stop and really look at this because this feels incredibly bleak. If predicting the future in the socioeconomic world is impossible, what are we supposed to do? Just throw our hands up? Are we just waiting to be destroyed by the next random, uncomputable event?
No, and this is where the text pivots from diagnosis to solution. We have to completely abandon the obsession with prediction and start focusing entirely on our exposure to failure.
Exposure to failure.
We have to shift from forecasting to architecture. How are our systems built to handle the shock when it inevitably comes?
Architecture over prediction. The text uses the nuclear industry post-Fukushima as a prime example of this shift, actually. Before the disaster, you had firms hiring legions of geologists and statisticians trying to predict the exact probability down to the decimal point of a massive earthquake and tsunami hitting a specific stretch of coastline on a specific Tuesday.
Which, as we know in Extremistan, is impossible.
Right. So some of the more intelligent nuclear engineering firms realized that predicting the failure is irrelevant. Instead, they focused purely on exposure. They started designing reactors that are much smaller, and they began embedding them deep underground with multiple independent layers of physical protection.
The mechanism there is decoupling. They decouple the potential damage from the trigger event. Even if a totally unforeseen, unmodeled disaster strikes like a meteor or an unprecedented tectonic shift, the reactor might fail, but that failure is contained.
It will not leak radiation to the outside world.
Exactly. They bounded their downside.
Another great example from the sources is the Swedish government's fiscal policy back in 1991. Governments normally build their budgets based on economic forecasts, right?
Yeah, they assume a 2.5% GDP growth, and they spend accordingly.
But when a recession hits, the forecast is wrong, the revenue drops, and the budget collapses.
But the Swedes restructured their budgets to be completely independent of economic forecasts. They accepted that economists simply cannot predict recessions, so they engineered a fiscal architecture that would remain solvent, even if a severe recession materialized out of nowhere.
Okay, let's unpack this. I'm trying to think of an analogy to make this visceral. Let's think about building a house.
Okay.
If you live in a hurricane zone, you don't sit there with a supercomputer trying to predict the exact minute a hurricane will form next year. You don't try to calculate the exact barometric pressure of the wind or the precise path the eye of the storm will take. That is wasted energy because the weather is too chaotic.
So what do you do instead?
You focus on the architecture. You just build a house with deeply driven concrete pilings, reinforced steel beams, and shatterproof storm shutters. You engineer a house capable of withstanding Category 5 winds from any direction.
Right.
It doesn't matter when the hurricane comes or what path it takes. You focus on how the system takes the hit, not forecasting the hit.
That is a much better way to frame it.
Mm-hmm.
You are manipulating your exposure, not the event itself. And this brings us to a major inflection point in our deep dive. If prediction is a dead end, and if simply focusing on building a strong house is only part of the solution, we need a brand new vocabulary.
A new vocabulary.
We need a new way to classify how things react to the unexpected, which brings us to the core framework of the source material, the triad.
The triad. Okay, so this is the map of the world according to this text. It categorizes everything: objects, biological systems, economic policies, even your personal habits, based on how they respond to disorder, stress, and volatility. And there are 3 categories.
Go ahead.
I'll take the first one, which is fragile. The fragile desperately wants tranquility. It needs the world to be perfectly, predictably calm.
The defining characteristic of the fragile is that it has a massive downside from shocks and zero upside.
Right. The text uses the sword of Damocles from Greek mythology. Damocles gets to sit on a golden throne at a magnificent banquet, but there is a heavy, razor-sharp sword dangling right over his head, held by a single horse's hair.
Talk about stressful.
Yeah. He looks powerful, but he is incredibly fragile. It only takes one tiny snap, one small, unexpected breeze, and he is dead. There is no upside to the sword falling.
A more modern, everyday example is a porcelain teacup. If you put a teacup in a padded box and leave it on a shelf, it is fine. It survives in tranquility. But if you drop it or shake the box, it shatters. It can only be harmed by volatility.
Okay, so that's the fragile. Then we move to the middle of the triad. The second category is robust. Now, my instinct is to think that robust is the goal. A robust system simply doesn't care about disorder. It can take a shock and remain exactly the same.
The mythological equivalent the text uses here is the phoenix. The phoenix is consumed by fire, a massive shock, but it is reborn from the ashes in the exact same state as before.
It survives the volatility, but it does not improve. Like
Wow.
a heavy cast iron anvil. You can drop it, you can hit it with a sledgehammer, you can leave it out in a thunderstorm. It just sits there. It is completely indifferent to the stress. It doesn't break, but it doesn't get better.
And for a long time, human engineering has stopped right there. We thought robustness was the ultimate pinnacle of design. But the text introduces the third category, and this is the revelation. This is anti-fragile.
Antifragile, the exact opposite of fragile, and this is where my mind gets blown because the antifragile doesn't just survive shocks and volatility, it actually needs them. It grows, thrives, and benefits from disorder.
If the fragile is the sword of Damocles and the robust is the phoenix, the anti-fragile is the hydra. In the myth, you cut off one head of the hydra and two more grow back in its place.
The hydra actually loves the swordsman.
Exactly. It needs to be attacked. It needs to experience trauma in order to get stronger.
What's fascinating here is the linguistics of it. The text points out that before this framework, we didn't actually have a word for the exact opposite of fragile. If you ask someone what is the opposite of fragile, they usually say strong or robust or unbreakable.
Which is a fundamental categorical error.
Hmm.
The opposite of negative is positive, not neutral. The robust is merely neutral to shocks. The antifragile is positive to shocks.
Right.
Evolution is antifragile. It uses the death of individual organisms to strengthen the genetic code of the whole species. Your immune system is antifragile.
Oh, that makes sense.
If you keep a child in a perfectly sterile bubble, their immune system doesn't remain robust. It becomes catastrophically fragile. It requires exposure to pathogens to learn and improve.
So the mission for you, the listener, in a world full of unpredictable black swans, is to look at your life, your career, your finances, and ask, am I the porcelain cup? Am I the anvil? Or am I the hydra? The goal is to move as much of your life as possible into the anti-fragile column. But how? This all sounds great in theory, but I need practical mechanics. The text gives us a very specific mechanism called the barbell strategy.
Let's break down the mechanics of the barbell or the bimodal strategy. The barbell is a physical metaphor. Imagine a weightlifter's bar. It has massive, heavy iron plates on both extreme ends and nothing but a thin, empty steel bar in the middle.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The philosophy here is to completely avoid the middle or the moderate path.
Wait, avoid the middle. We are always taught that moderation is the key to everything, the golden mean, a balanced portfolio. Why is the middle bad?
Because in the realm of extremistan and unpredictable risk, the middle is a sucker's game. It is a zone packed with hidden fragilities. When you try to be medium risk, you are relying entirely on the accuracy of your risk models.
Which we know are flawed.
Right. And as we established with the 2008 trader, if your model miscalculates a black swan, your medium risk asset can instantly drop to zero. To become anti-fragile, the barbell strategy dictates that you combine extreme paranoia on one end with extreme aggressiveness on the other.
I need a concrete example to understand how extreme paranoia and extreme risk go together. Let's look at personal finance, because that's where people feel this the most.
Okay. A standard financial advisor tells you to put your money in a medium risk portfolio, say 60% standard stocks and 40% corporate bonds. But if a massive systemic crash happens, both those asset classes can plummet simultaneously. You are fragile to the miscalculation of correlation.
So how does the barbell fix that?
With a barbell, you take 90% of your money and you put it in the absolute safest, most boring, bulletproof vehicles available. Things that cannot fail even in a depression. Inflation-protected cash or the highest grade government treasury bills.
Okay.
You accept a very low return in exchange for absolute paranoia and certainty.
Okay, so my downside is totally capped. I can only lose 10% of my net worth in the worst possible scenario. But what about that remaining 10%?
You take that remaining 10% and you put it in maximally risky, highly speculative ventures, things with a massive potential payoff. Angel investing in wild tech startups or far out of the money options.
I've got to push back here. You are telling me that putting 10% of my life savings into incredibly reckless, highly likely to fail startup ventures is somehow making me safer. That sounds like a recipe to just slowly lose 10% of my money every single year.
It's about the asymmetry of the payoff. If we connect this to the mathematical reality of extremistan, look at the bounds. In the absolute worst-case scenario, a total market meltdown where every single startup goes bankrupt, your speculative 10% goes to zero, but you only lose 10%.
Right, maximum loss is mathematically capped.
Exactly. You cannot be ruined. The 90% is safe. But
But
because you are playing an extremist stand, if just one of those wild speculative bets pays off, it doesn't return 10%. It returns 100 times or 1,000 times your investment.
Oh, wow.
You have strictly bounded your downside, but you have left your upside completely unbounded. You are protected from the negative black swan, but highly exposed to the positive black swan.
Wow. Okay. That totally flips my understanding of risk. Extreme safety on one end, extreme risk on the other. Nothing in the middle. And this concept of unbounded upside brings us to another massive pillar of the system outlined in the sources, optionality.
Optionality is the secret engine of human progress and natural evolution. At its core, an option is simply having the right, but not the obligation, to do something.
The right, but not the obligation. So it's about freedom of choice after the fact.
Exactly. And why this is so powerful is that it allows for rational tinkering and trial and error. The text emphasizes that you do not need a high IQ, you don't need perfect knowledge, and you certainly don't need flawless predictive abilities if you have optionality.
Because you don't need to predict what will happen, you just wait to see what does happen and then choose.
Right. If you have the option to keep what works and immediately discard what doesn't, you don't even need to understand why something works. You just need the basic rationality to recognize a favorable outcome when it sits in front of you.
This reminds me of my absolute favorite anecdote from the text. It perfectly illustrates how we can use optionality in everyday life, not just in high finance. It's the Saturday evening in London scenario.
Oh, walk us through it.
So the author is in London, figuring out what to do for the evening. He has a baseline option: sit in his hotel room and read a book. That is completely safe, zero downside, but relatively low upside. It's a known quantity. Then an acquaintance invites him to a party in Kensington. But the key is how the invitation is framed. It's loose, drop by if you want, no pressure to stay.
This is pure optionality.
Exactly. The author isn't forced to stay for a 3-course sit-down dinner. He goes to the party. If he walks in and the people are boring, the music is terrible, and the conversation is dull, what does he do? He just leaves. He gets a taxi and goes back to his book. What is the downside?
The downside is capped. Maybe an hour of wasted time and the 30-pound cost of a cab. A trivial loss.
But what if he goes to the party and he meets a fascinating entrepreneur who wants to fund his next project? Or he meets his future spouse? The upside is completely unbounded and life-changing.
That is the essence of convex tinkering. You are intentionally placing yourself in environments where you can make small, low-cost mistakes, going to a bad party, trying a cheap new hobby, pitching a wild idea to a boss, where the maximum loss is known and trivial. But the potential payoff is a positive black swan.
Right.
Nature is the ultimate user of optionality. Nature produces millions of genetic mutations. Most of them fail miserably. But the cost of that failure to the overall species is small. However, the one mutation that allows the animal to run faster or see better, that succeeds, and it propels the entire species forward.
Nature doesn't have a blueprint. It just tinkers, keeps the good, and discards the bad. Which perfectly transitions us to the next practical concept in the system. If we want to optimize our lives, if we want to improve our businesses or our health, our modern instinct is always to add something.
Yes, addition is the modern disease.
If I want to be healthier, I buy a new fitness app, I add a complex 45-minute working routine, I add a new superfood smoothie with 12 ingredients. If a company wants to improve, they add a new management layer, they add a new software suite. But the text argues for the exact opposite. It introduces the concept of via negativa.
Via negativa is a concept originally drawn from theology and philosophy. It essentially means the focus on what something is not, rather than what it is. In the context of antifragility, it translates to optimization through subtraction.
Subtraction, so removing things.
Yes. The underlying mechanism here is epistemological. We know what is wrong in a system with vastly greater clarity and certainty than we know what is right. It is much easier to identify a toxic habit than it is to identify a magically curative habit. Therefore, the most mathematically robust way to improve a system is to remove the fragile parts, rather than trying to paste on new, complex, theoretically good parts.
I want to make an analogy here to test my understanding. It's like tending to a bonsai tree. If you want to make a bonsai tree more beautiful and healthier, you don't go out and glue new synthetic branches onto it.
No, that would be ridiculous.
You take shears and you carefully cut away the dead wood. You prune the branches that are blocking the sunlight. You subtract the impediments, and the natural system flourishes on its own.
That is exactly how via negativa works. You remove the downside risk. So ask yourself, as a listener, how often do you try to add a complicated new habit to fix your life? when the statistically smarter move is simply to remove one terrible habit.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to orchestrate that complex morning meditation and smoothie routine to fix your chronic fatigue, what if you just stopped scrolling on your phone at 1 a.m.? What if you just stopped eating refined sugar? What if you just quit smoking?
So what does this all mean? The subtraction is vastly more powerful, and crucially, it is way less prone to side effects. If I take an experimental new supplement, I might get liver damage. But if I just stop drinking alcohol, there are zero negative side effects. Right.
The text even drops a great quote from Steve Jobs here, who famously said that innovation isn't saying yes to everything. It's saying no to 1,000 things, so you can aggressively focus on the one thing that actually matters.
It is the less is more heuristic. But the text points out a massive headwind we face in applying this. We have a profound cultural bias against subtraction. We suffer from something called intervention bias.
What drives intervention bias? Why is it so hard to just do less?
Follow the incentives. Bureaucrats, doctors, consultants, and corporate managers are compensated to do things. A high-priced consultant is not going to charge a corporation $1 million just to walk in and say, stop holding the Tuesday morning meeting, it's hurting productivity.
Right, they'd get fired.
They have to sell you a complex 500-page positive action plan to justify their fee. But via negativa, removing the pebbles from your shoe, as the text says, is how antifragility naturally operates. It is free, and it reduces complexity rather than adding it. Okay, so let's pause and synthesize this. We have the barbell strategy to cap our downside. We have optionality to harvest unbounded upside without needing to predict the future. And we have via negativa to optimize by removing fragility. This all makes incredible psychological and strategic sense. But the sources keep hinting at a deeper layer. This isn't just a clever philosophy or a mindset. There's a literal, mathematical, and biological engine driving why this works. Which means we need to look under the hood.
We need to understand the mechanics of why fragility is nonlinear. To do that, we have to introduce two fundamental mathematical concepts from the text: convexity and concavity. Now, we aren't going to draw equations on a chalkboard, but grasping the visual intuition of these curves is absolutely essential to understanding the world.
Let's start with convexity. What does it look like and what does it mean?
Visually, a convex curve smalls upward. It curves up like a bowl. What this represents is favorable asymmetry. It means that as variation, stress, or time increases, your benefits accelerate vastly faster than your harms. The upside is explosive and open-ended, while the downside is flat and capped.
So the barbell strategy and the party in London, those are convex positions.
Exactly. Now, concavity is the exact opposite. Visually, it frowns downward. It looks like a dome. This represents unfavorable asymmetry. As stress or variation increases, your harm and your losses accelerate vastly faster than your benefits. You might make steady, tiny gains for a long time, but your downside is a cliff that goes straight to zero.
The 2008 trader relying on his models, he was making steady, small profits every day, feeling like a genius, and then one sudden variation wiped out 10 years of gains in an hour. He was deeply concave.
Yes, and the text uses a concept called Jensen's inequality to explain the mathematical supremacy of convexity.
Okay, I read the section on Jensen's inequality, and I have to admit, my eyes glazed over a bit with the formula. Can you explain the actual mechanism of it without the jargon? Why does it matter so much?
Think of it this way. If you are in a convex position, meaning your payoff curve smiles upward, the variation itself is your friend. Let's say you make 10 investments using the barbell strategy. Because your downside is capped at a very small amount, you can afford to lose on 9 out of the 10 bets. 9 times you lose $1. But on the 10th bet, because the upside is unbounded, you make $100.
Ah, so because the curve accelerates upward, the single win mathematically dominates all the small losses combined.
Exactly. You don't have to be right very often. You could be wrong more than 50% of the time, you can fail over and over again, and you will still vastly outperform over the long run because the magnitude of the win outweighs the frequency of the losses.
This raises a really provocative question then. If the math works this way, can you be completely ignorant and still succeed?
The text argues unequivocally.
Yes.
You can be dumb and anti-fragile, and you will vastly outperform someone who is smart and fragile.
That feels like an attack on the entire modern education system.
It is. If the smart person, the Harvard-educated trader, is in a concave position, meaning they make small, steady gains but have a massive hidden risk of blowing up their high IQ, and their complex spreadsheets will not save them when the black swan hits. The math of the cliff doesn't care how smart you are. But the dumb person who is just blindly tinkering, failing small and holding convex options will eventually stumble into a massive payout.
That is mind-bending. But it isn't just math on a spreadsheet. This convexity is literally built into our DNA. Let's look at the biological proof of this system. The text uses a medical phenomenon called hormesis.
Hormesis is the biological mechanism of antifragility. It is the phenomenon where a small dose of a harmful substance, a toxin, or a physical stressor actually stimulates a beneficial, overcompensating response in an organism.
The classic example is lifting weights. When you go to the gym and lift a heavy barbell, you aren't actually building muscle in that moment. You are doing the opposite. You are literally causing micro tears in your muscle fibers. You are subjecting them to trauma and stress.
But your body doesn't just repair the muscle back to its exact previous state. It is not merely robust. The body overcompensates. It assumes that since you experience that stress today, you might experience a worse stress tomorrow. So it repairs the muscle fibers to be denser and stronger than they were before. The stress causes growth.
But there is a limit, right? Human bodies are only anti-fragile up to a certain point. If you drop a 2-ton car on a weightlifter, their body doesn't get stronger, they just die.
Correct. Biological systems have a break point. But what is equally important is what happens when you remove the stress entirely. The text gives a very vivid hypothetical. Imagine you decide to protect your body completely. You spend an entire month in bed, depriving your system of all physical stress, gravity, and variation. You just lie there perfectly safe watching all 86 episodes of The Sopranos. What physically happens to you?
You decay. Your muscles atrophy. Your bone density drops precipitously because your skeleton isn't resisting gravity. Your cardiovascular system weakens. By completely removing the stress to protect the body, you are literally killing the organic system.
Depriving an anti-fragile system of volatility actively harms it. That is the first rule. But we also have to understand the non-linearity of that harm. And this is where the text uses a brilliant, visceral analogy about jumping to explain the mechanics of fragility.
This was the analogy that finally made the math click for me. Let's walk through it. Imagine you have a human being and you ask them to jump off a wall from a height of 30 feet, which is roughly 10 meters, down to the solid ground.
What is the biological result?
They would likely die, or at the very least, they would shatter their femurs and completely destroy their spine. That is a massive, extreme, singular shock to a fragile biological frame.
Exactly. Now let's take that exact same cumulative distance, 30 feet, but instead of one single massive jump, we distribute the stress.
Wow.
We ask the person to jump off a tiny ledge that is exactly 1 millimeter high, and we have them jump off that 1 millimeter ledge 10,000 times. The total distance fallen is identical. 30 feet.
But the biological result is completely different. Jumping 1 millimeter 10,000 times is nothing. It's basically just pacing around your living room for an afternoon. It is perfectly harmless. In fact, it might even be good cardiovascular exercise.
And right there is the core mathematical truth of fragility. It explains why the 2008 trader blew up. A fragile object, or a fragile organism, is hurt vastly, disproportionately more, by rare, extreme shocks than by the cumulative effect of many small shocks.
Because the harm accelerates non-linearly as the intensity of the single shock increases. The 30-foot jump doesn't cause 10,000 times more damage than the 1 millimeter jump. It causes 1,000,000 times more damage.
Precisely. Therefore, the absolute worst, most dangerous thing you can do for a fragile system is to suppress the small daily variations. When you stop the small forest fires, you allow all the dead wood to accumulate. You are just storing up combustible energy for one massive, lethal, system-destroying shock.
Which brings us into a massive conflict with how the modern world operates. The modern world is completely obsessed with efficiency. We go to business schools to learn how to run perfectly optimized, lean supply chains with zero excess inventory sitting in warehouses. We want to remove all the waste. But based on this math, the text argues that this naive efficiency is incredibly dangerous.
It is dangerous because efficiency inherently requires the removal of redundancy. Natural systems, which have survived for millions of years, absolutely love functional redundancy. They are incredibly inefficient by design. Think about the human body again. We have 2 lungs, 2 kidneys, 2 eyes. We have vast amounts of seemingly spare capacity.
To a modern corporate efficiency consultant, having 2 kidneys is a complete waste of resources. Why devote calories and blood flow to carrying that extra weight when 1 kidney filters the blood just fine 99% of the time? They would recommend surgically removing the 2nd kidney to make the body leaner.
But nature knows better. Redundancy is not waste. It is an insurance policy against extremistan. It is how you survive the unexpected, uncomputable shock. When you strip all the redundancy out of a supply chain to make it perfectly efficient, when you have parts arriving just in time from a single factory across the globe, you are sailing dangerously close to the wind. The slightest shift in the weather, the slightest delay, and the entire production line capsizes.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This contrast between the rigid, hyper-efficient modern planner and the robust natural system introduces us to a fascinating character archetype in the text. The rational flâneur.
The flâneur is a wonderful concept. It's a French term for a stroller, a saunterer, someone who wanders the city streets without any strict destination. The text contrasts the rational flâneur with the typical tourist.
Let's look at the tourist first. The tourist operates like a modern corporation. They have a heavily scheduled, highly efficient itinerary. 9:00 a.m., they must be at the Louvre. 11:00 a.m., they must be at the top of the Eiffel Tower. 1:00 p.m. is a strict reservation for lunch at a highly reviewed bistro.
The tourist is terribly fragile to disruption. Their plan is tightly coupled. If the line at the Louvre takes an hour longer than expected, or if the metro experiences a mechanical delay, their entire day cascades into ruin. They miss the Eiffel Tower, they lose their lunch reservation, and they experience massive emotional concavity. They're stressed, angry, and miserable.
But the rational the flaneur steps out of the hotel with no rigid plan. They just start walking. They revise their schedule opportunistically based on new unfolding information. They see an interesting alleyway, so they turn down it. They smell fresh bread, so they stop at a bakery that wasn't in any guidebook.
They are operating purely on optionality. They're completely immune to the collapse of a rigid plan because they didn't have one to begin with. The metro breaking down means nothing to them. They are in a state to harvest the positive black swans of the city, the serendipitous encounters, and the hidden gems.
I love that. Be the flaneur of your own life. But if nature, biology, and the mathematics of convexity so clearly favor antifragility, and if being a flaneur is vastly more robust than being a rigid planner, this raises an enormous question. Why do human beings keep doing the opposite? Why do we constantly build human-made architectures, like banking systems and corporate hierarchies that are mathematically doomed to collapse?
This is where we have to shift our focus from the math to the humans. Our deep dive requires us to look at the psychology and the incentive structures of the modern world. The text argues that modernity itself has engineered a unique set of catastrophic vulnerabilities. Let's look closer at the concept of complexity.
Right. In our pursuit of global efficiency, we have created massive, tangled interdependence. We have hyperglobalization, interconnected digital financial systems, and those fragile supply chains we just talked about.
And complexity fundamentally alters how failure behaves. In a highly complex, tightly coupled system, a single localized failure does not stay isolated. It creates what the text calls cascades. Think back to 2008. A relatively small number of subprime mortgage defaults in a specific region of Florida or Nevada didn't just hurt the local banks. It triggered a cascading liquidity crisis that caused the banking system in Iceland to collapse, which affected pension funds in Europe.
The interconnectedness eliminates the fire breaks. In the past, if a local bank failed, it was a tragedy for that town, but it didn't burn down the global economy. When the system is perfectly optimized and deeply connected, the failure of the weakest link halts the entire global machine.
And a major driver of this dangerous complexity is something we touched on in the opening, with the doctor prescribing sedatives, but the text gives it a formal, critical name: iatrogenics.
Iatrogenics. This literally translates from Greek as harm caused by the healer. It's the damage done when an intervention, which is genuinely meant to help or cure, actually causes more harm than doing absolutely nothing at all.
Modernity is absolutely plagued by intervention bias. We have this deep, almost neurotic need to constantly take action, to constantly apply via positiva. We cannot bear to watch a natural fluctuation without trying to manage it.
Okay, the source material provides a very specific and honestly a highly controversial example to illustrate iatrogenics in the medical field. It tackles the subject of routine, unconditional mammograms for women over 40. And I want to pause here and step out of the analyst role for a second, because my immediate visceral instinct as a listener is to reject this completely. You were telling me that early screening for cancer is actually bad. That goes against literally everything public health campaigns teach us about preventative medicine. If we catch a tumor early, we save a life. Walk me through the actual numbers here, because this sounds crazy.
It is a perfect example of how counterintuitive the math of extremistan and iatrogenics can be. The text analyzes the statistical outcomes of testing an entire population unconditionally. The argument presented is that our diagnostic tools have become incredibly sensitive. They spot tiny microscopic tumors or anomalies.
Which sounds like a good thing.
But the text argues that a vast majority of these microscopic anomalies are not the type of aggressive cancer that will end a patient's life. The body's own antifragile immune system might naturally resolve them, or they might grow so slowly they never cause harm. However, once the tumor is spotted on the scan, human psychology takes over.
The doctor feels compelled to intervene.
Exactly. The doctor panics, the patient panics. The doctor prescribes highly toxic chemotherapy or invasive surgeries or heavy radiation for a tumor that, statistically, would never have killed the patient.
So the intervention itself, the toxic radiation or the surgical complications, actually damages the patient's health and can even shorten their life.
That is the argument the text makes. It argues that there is a break-even point in interventions. When the disease is severe, the intervention is absolutely justified. But when the disease is incredibly mild or merely potential, the hidden risks of the treatment, the iatrogenics, often outweigh the benefits of the cure. Doing nothing would mathematically result in fewer deaths.
Okay, I understand the statistical logic now, even if it's uncomfortable, and we need to be very clear here as impartial reporters of the text. We are not doctors, and we are not giving medical advice. We are simply conveying the logical argument the author uses to demonstrate harm caused by the healer.
And what makes this so difficult to discuss is how emotionally and politically charged it becomes. The text notes a specific historical instance to highlight this societal pressure. It mentions politician Hillary Clinton claiming that critics of unconditional mammogram testing were, quote, killing women.
And to be clear, regardless of your politics, left or right, the text is not making a partisan attack here. It is using this quote strictly to frame how violently society, and politicians in general, overreact to anyone who suggests not intervening. It highlights the immense social pressure to do something. The optics of taking action look compassionate and caring, while the logic of via negativa suggesting we wait and see looks cold and negligent, even if the math proves it saves more lives.
The political example is used solely to demonstrate the blindness to iatrogenics. It shows how difficult it is for a system to learn to leave things alone. But this brings us back to the root cause. Why is there such an unstoppable push for intervention? Why do managers, politicians, and bankers keep constructing these fragile, highly complex, intervention-heavy systems? The text gives us the foundational ethical cause of fragility, a lack of skin in the game.
Skin in the game. This might be the most famous concept to spin out of Taleb's work. Let's look at it historically. In the past, the people who held status, power, and decision-making authority were the ones who personally took the risks.
A Roman general is the perfect example. He didn't direct battles from a bunker thousands of miles away. He led his troops from the front line. If he made a bad strategic decision, if his plan was fragile, he was very often the first one to die. He physically held the downside for his actions. The symmetry was perfect.
But today, the text argues, the exact reverse is taking place. We have created a massive structural asymmetry. The text identifies a new class of inverse heroes. These are bureaucrats, policy wonks, corporate executives, and those Davos-attending bankers.
The text, playfully but pointedly, calls them the IAND, the International Association of Name Droppers. These are individuals who have cleverly positioned themselves within the complex system to extract all the upside of volatility, but they transfer all the downside, the absolute risk of ruin, to the unsuspecting citizens and taxpayers.
The 2008 banker is the ultimate archetype here. The banker makes insanely complex trades. When those trades go well, he takes a multi-million-dollar cash bonus. He extracts the upside. But when those same complex, fragile trades inevitably blow up the global economy, the banker doesn't have to sell his house to cover the losses. The government steps in and uses taxpayer money to bail out the bank. The banker keeps his previous bonuses, and the citizen absorbs the ruin.
The banker has absolutely no skin in the game. And the text provides what it views as a central, absolute ethical rule here. It is almost biblical in its phrasing. Thou shalt not have anti-fragility at the expense of the fragility of others.
Wow. Let me write that down mentally. Thou shalt not have anti-fragility at the expense of the fragility of others.
If you are getting the upside, and you are using complex legal or corporate structures to pass the downside to someone else, you are a fragilista. You are actively creating hidden risks that will eventually destroy the system because you have no personal incentive to prevent them.
And part of how this dangerous class maintains its power, part of how they convince the public to let them run things, is through a massive illusion of knowledge. They believe that because they understand the narrative or the academic theory of a thing, they understand the actual risk of a thing.
This is a critical error the text identifies as the green lumber fallacy.
I love this story. Let's decode the green lumber fallacy. It's based on a true story about a highly successful, extraordinarily wealthy commodities trader. This guy made millions trading green lumber. Now, if you asked a Harvard economics professor what it takes to trade green lumber successfully, they would say you need to study forestry, you need to understand tree species, supply chains in the Pacific Northwest, and the chemical process of logging.
You would assume the trader had encyclopedic knowledge of the commodity.
Right. But it turned out this master trader, the guy making all the money, literally thought green lumber was wood that had been painted green. He had absolutely no idea that the term just meant freshly cut, unseasoned wood with high moisture content.
What's fascinating here is that his complete laughable ignorance of the narrative description of the lumber did not matter one bit to his success. Why?
Because knowing the encyclopedic facts of green lumber doesn't make you a good trader. Knowing how to manage your risk is what makes you a good trader. He understood price action, he knew how to clip his downside, and he knew how to maximize his upside.
The fallacy is confusing the narrative with the exposure. The bureaucrats, the fragilistas, and the IND have all the facts. They have all the data, the PowerPoint decks, and the academic theories. But they lack the visceral risk management skills that only come from having true skin in the game, from actually trading and feeling the pain of a loss.
But wait, if we connect all this, I'm looking at the notes, and there is a massive, dark contradiction sitting right at the center of this entire philosophy. We are demanding individual protection from exploitation. We want people to have skin in the game so they don't harm others. We want to protect the taxpayer. But if we look at how natural systems actually achieve their incredible anti-fragility, it might require the exact opposite of protecting people.
You have hit on the most difficult part of the text, which brings us to the final and most philosophically tense segment of our deep dive, the critical tension between the system and the individual.
We have to lean into the dark side of anti-fragility now.
We do. The text makes a chilling, undeniable observation about how systems work. The anti-fragility of the whole usually depends on the extreme fragility of its parts.
Say that again, let that sink in. The survival of the whole depends on the destruction of the parts.
Yes. Think back to evolution, the ultimate anti-fragile system. How does a species become stronger, more adapted, and resilient over millions of years? It is solely because individual organisms, the weaker, slower, or less adapted ones, die. The individual's death, their ultimate fragility and ruin, is the brutal mechanism that purges weakness from the genetic pool of the collective. The system needs the individual to fail and die.
Okay, that's nature. But let's look at a modern human system, the restaurant industry. The restaurant industry in a hyper-competitive city like New York or Tokyo is incredible. It is highly adaptive, it constantly improves, it creates amazing new cuisines. It is a deeply anti-fragile ecosystem. But why is it anti-fragile?
Because individual restaurants are horribly, tragically fragile. They go bankrupt constantly. The owners lose their life savings. The chefs lose their jobs. The bad recipes, the poor management, the overpriced menus, they are ruthlessly removed from the city's pool by the harsh mechanism of bankruptcy.
If the government stepped in and acted compassionately, if they artificially bailed out every single failing restaurant to protect the individual owners from the financial pain of failure, the overall restaurant industry would stagnate. It would become terrible. The quality of food would plummet, and eventually the whole system would become fragile to a real crisis.
So to make society truly anti-fragile, we have to let individuals fail. We have to let businesses go bankrupt. We have to let the stress destroy the weak components so the strong can thrive. That is a profound and honestly a very harsh, unforgiving tension.
It is harsh. And it flies in the face of how modern society tries to organize itself. We constantly try to protect the failing parts.
We try to protect them because of how academics and planners think the world works, as opposed to how it actually works. Which brings us to a critique the text calls the Soviet-Harvard illusion.
Right. The text also refers to this as the lecturing birds how to fly effect. Let's break this down. There is this deeply held belief in modern culture taught in every university that institutional science, formal academia, and theoretical research are the primary drivers of technology and economic wealth. The story goes, scientists come up with a theory, engineers apply the theory, and then wealth is generated.
But Taleb argues the historical record shows the reverse is actually true. He argues that blind tinkering, messy trial and error, and optionality by random, uncredentialed individuals operating in the real world is what actually drives true innovation, The Industrial Revolution wasn't driven by theoretical physicists, it was driven by tinkerers trying to make better looms and steam engines.
These tinkerers take massive personal risks. Many of them fail and go bankrupt. They are the fragile parts being destroyed. But the few who succeed create the massive breakthroughs.
And then, after the breakthroughs happened, what does academia do? Academia swoops in, writes the history books, formalizes the math behind the invention, and takes all the credit for driving the progress. They act like they taught the birds how to fly, when in reality, the birds were flying perfectly fine on their own through natural evolutionary trial and error.
It's the illusion that episteme, top-down, theoretical knowledge creates wealth, when actually it's bottom-up trial and error that creates wealth. But this brings me right back to my struggle with this philosophy. If we are supposed to reject top-down planning, if we are just meant to be tinkerers, if we are just meant to use trial and error, fail fast, and accept being the individual restaurants going bankrupt so the overall system can evolve, isn't that incredibly painful for the person failing? Are we as individuals just meant to accept being cannon fodder for the system's glorious evolution?
It is a valid anxiety, but the text anticipates this dread and offers a powerful philosophical shield, Stoicism. Specifically, it points us toward the life of Seneca, looking at what we can call Seneca's asymmetry.
Seneca was a Roman philosopher, but he was also one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the entire empire. He was an advisor to Nero. He had a massive amount to lose. He was sitting under a giant sort of Damocles. How did he handle that anxiety?
He domesticated the uncertainty. He realized he could not control the chaotic, extremistan world of Roman politics, where you could be wealthy one day and executed the next. So he engaged in an emotional via negativa.
An emotional subtraction. How?
He mentally and literally wrote off all his wealth. He regularly practiced living as if he were completely ruined. He would eat the simplest, cheapest food, wear rough, scratchy clothes, and sleep on the hard ground. By physically and emotionally accepting the absolute worst-case scenario, he totally removed the psychological downside of losing his fortune.
He created an emotional barbell strategy.
Exactly. He ensured that he always had more to gain than to lose from the dictates of fate. If he kept his massive wealth, great, he could enjoy it. But if Nero suddenly confiscated it all, he was already mentally and physically prepared. The loss wouldn't destroy his soul.
He clipped his emotional downside. So the goal for the listener isn't to just blindly throw yourself into the meat grinder of trial and error and hope you aren't the one who gets crushed. The goal is to consciously construct your life through the barbell, through optionality, through limiting your downside risk, so that when you do inevitably fail, the failure is a small, manageable paper cut. It's not a fatal blow. You survive the failure, you learn the lesson, and you get to wake up and tinker again tomorrow.
You engineer your exposure. You want to be the one who benefits from the volatility of extremistan, not the one who is destroyed by it.
And as we synthesize this incredible, sprawling journey, let's recap exactly where we've gone today. We started by tearing down the illusion of the predictive paradigm. You simply cannot predict the black swan. The turkey doesn't see Thanksgiving coming, and no computer model will ever map the infinite variables of real life. Once we accept that sobering reality, we have to shift our focus entirely to architecture, to how we handle the shock. We have to move away from being the fragile porcelain cup. We have to realize that being the merely robust anvil isn't enough. And we must aim to become the hydra, the anti-fragile system that actually grows from disorder.
And the tools to do that are deeply practical.
Exactly. We utilize the barbell strategy, extreme safety on one side to totally clip our risk of ruin, combined with extreme speculative risk on the other to open ourselves up to massive asymmetric upside. We lean heavily into optionality, making small, reversible choices that cost very little if we are wrong, but could pay off huge if we are right. And we optimize our lives and our businesses not by blindly adding more complex routines or expensive consultants, but through via negative, ruthlessly removing the fragile, harmful habits and interventions that expose us to ruin.
But as we pull all these threads together, we are left staring at that great ethical and structural contradiction of the anti-fragile worldview. And this raises an important question, one that extends far beyond the pages of the text and challenges the very fabric of our modern morality. If the collective robustness of our society, our economies, and our evolution truly depends on the violent sacrifice of the fragile parts, the bankrupt businesses, the ruined careers, the tinkerers who fail, and even dying individuals, at what point is that terrible cost to the individual no longer justified by the strength of the overall system?
That is the heavy, lingering reality we all have to grapple with. How much pain are we willing to let the parts endure to save the whole? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I encourage you to look at your own life, your own portfolios, your own health habits, and your own assumptions. Where have you allowed yourself to become the fragile porcelain cup, sitting quietly on the shelf, just hoping the table never shakes? And where, starting today, can you begin to build your own Hydra? Until next time.
If this video was useful, give it a like, subscribe, and share. More systems and frameworks in the next Eudaimanya video.